Welcome back. Thank you all for joining us for this particular episode on marketing and minimising vacancy. Firstly, I just want to shout out to Richard Sims from Sims for Property for helping out last week with a question that a client had on the percentage increases around Launceston market, so in particular suburbs within Launceston and how that market has increased. So he was able to provide that report. So thank you, Richard, for sending through that information. That was great. So we're going to break down this particular subject into two sessions because I feel like there's quite a bit of information to get through in one episode. So we're going to break it into two episodes. This particular subject, marketing and minimising vacancies. So quite a complex thing, and obviously really important part of having your property rented is obviously making sure that you minimise that time that the property is vacant, once again burning a hole in your pocket. So this is what we want to avoid, and there are a few tips that I have around balancing out obviously the time that the property is vacant with achieving the highest possible rent. So these are the discussions that we obviously have with our new clients around how we can avoid the property being vacant for an extended period of time whilst trying to achieve that highest possible rental yield, obviously. So a few points that I would like to discuss there. I guess the most important is, and every, agent or property manager, whether you're selling a property or whether you're renting a property, they're the same rules. The first is timing. So for having your property rented, it is when we start marketing the property prior to the available date. And that's an interesting question because some people feel like the earlier you go out with marketing the property, the more chance you have of filling the property in the time frame that you're hoping for. It doesn't necessarily work that way when you're looking at filling a rental property because tenants are looking within a window of time, and generally they're moving from one property to another. And they're generally doing that within a pretty short time frame because they need to give a notice period to the current owner if they're moving from another property. So usually they're looking within a 2 to 3 week window, sometimes 4 absolute max, but usually within that time frame. And generally they don't want to alarm their current property owner or agent that they're moving until such time as they've secured another property. So that's really interesting that they won't necessarily start looking too far in advance for that reason. So timing is really important, and your property manager should be advising you on that, but we would generally say around 10 to 14 days prior to the actual available date, move-in date for the property is ideal. The next important point is price, so setting your rental price, and obviously this is where you would seek advice from a property manager or you do your own research on what the market rents are currently. So setting the price is another subject in itself, but I think it's really important to make sure you're not pricing too high. So the third is presentation. So before you have your managing agent or if you're self-managing the property, before you're going down the track of advertising, you need to make sure that the presentation of the property is spot on. So making sure your gardens are tidy because obviously first impressions are really important, but right through the property, the entranceway, your walls are clean, your kitchen area is clean, your bathroom areas are clean. So when people are going through the property, obviously that's going to be appealing to them. So timing, price and presentation are the 3 areas that you really should be focused on before you start marketing the property. The next is to decide on when the available date for move-in is going to be, because you can work backwards from there and make sure that you have everything in place before you're ready to approve an application, because if you are having to delay that process of someone moving into your property, every single week that you make a delay, it's obviously costing you financially over that period of time. So being prepared and ready for the tenant to move in is really important. Presentation really is everything when you're presenting a property to the market. And not only that, obviously presenting the property ready for a tenant to move in, because you're setting the benchmark for what you expect the tenants to do after they've moved in. So you're setting the standard with obviously how you'd like the property to be returned. So that's a really important element. Preparing for marketing and inspections is the next side of that, and I think if you're still, there are lots of situations there. Some owners are still living in the property and they're looking to obviously find a tenant before they relocate. Sometimes we have a tenanted property and we're having to work around tenants, and sometimes we have a vacant property. So there are lots of different scenarios with how we go about arranging inspections. We as an agency, or my agency, I guess we do things a little bit differently to some, and that is that we pre-qualify our inquiry before we actually arrange inspections so that we know the timing, we know when someone's looking to move into a property, what their requirements are versus what the requirements are of that particular owner. So we're doing asking a few more questions before we actually set up those inspections. We do that so that we can arrange more one-on-one inspections rather than the typical open home that might take place with some other offices that you might find. And quite often tenants will have questions when they're viewing a property, and they can feel a little bit uncomfortable where there's a group environment. So having the opportunity to go through with a potential tenant one-on-one allows them to ask those questions about the property that they're hoping to cover off on. The next is marketing. Now, there's some interesting questions around whether or not we should be having professional photos, or whether or not the photos that the agency take are okay, or whether I can take photos on my iPhone, will they be perfectly fine? So whether I should have a video. So I think there's a lot more available in the marketplace now for marketing properties, and I guess there's obviously different options for sales and different options for renting. My personal view on that is that if you go back to those three primary points, and that's your timing, your price and your presentation, you don't necessarily need to invest a lot of money in marketing a property for rent. The vacancy rate at the moment is very low, so I think that's even more relevant, that if you get those things right, you don't necessarily need to have the big ad. I think that our particular agency, generally we would advise that you don't necessarily need to go to the expense of having professional images done. Keeping in mind too, though, it is a fairly small investment to make for photos that are probably going to last you the next 2, 3, 4 years, depending on how old the property is and if anything sort of changes over that time. So it really is a personal preference for each client to decide whether or not they would like to use those additional marketing tools. But I think that wraps it up for the first part of this particular topic, which is marketing and minimising vacancy. I hope to see you next week for part 2.